This is Dottori Kun, released by Sega in 1990, and it was probably their best-selling arcade game of the era in Japan. If you know anything about the history of games, this might come as a surprise because, well, it is pretty primitive for 1990 to say the least. Back then, Sega were known for their intense, cutting-edge games like G-Lock with its 360-degree rotating motion simulator. But this, well, forgive me for editorialising here, but Dottori Kun is pretty crappy. There is a reason for this game's existence, but it is an unusual one. You see, this was never actually meant to be played. No, it was made to be immediately thrown away. Why? Well, to get around some odd Japanese bureaucratic regulations. You see, classic coin-operated video games come in two varieties. There's dedicated cabinets, which are designed to play one specific game, usually with unique designs. For games with unusual controls or special features, this is essential for the full experience. But also there are generic cabinets that can host many different games. Not like a console, they don't have their own processing power, they're just cabinets housing controls, monitor, speakers, power supply, and of course a coin mechanism with maybe an illuminated sign at the top announcing the actual game inside. Designed purely for arcade game PCBs, which were standardised by the Japan Amusement Machinery and Manufacturers Association, or JAMMA, and given the popularity of Japanese games worldwide, this became the de facto standard. This was great for arcade operators, whether they had a handful of machines or a whole amusement park full. Double Dragon is the hot game, get the JAMMA PCB and slap it in your JAMMA cab. Final Fight comes along, well, you can put that in there without having to splash out for an entirely new machine. A good number of arcade games were just sold as PCB kits with maybe some artwork or instruction cards, especially common in later years. Japanese arcades or game centres were, and many still are, filled with what they call candy cabinets, white sit-down deluxe generic JAMMA cabs like these. And probably the biggest manufacturer of them, in the 90s at least, was Sega, whose City line was especially popular. And this is where Dottori Kun comes in, because thanks to obscure Japanese trading regulations enacted in 1990, no one was allowed to sell empty arcade cabinets. They had to come with a game included. It didn't matter what, they just had to be sold with a game to meet regulations. So Dottori Kun was the solution, the cheapest and simplest JAMMA-compatible PCB that met the criteria of being a game that Sega could include with their cabinets to make them fully legal. The game PCB itself was just supposed to be disposed of by the arcade operator when they got the machine, to be replaced with the game they actually wanted to put in there. But as these were apparently included with every Sega candy cab in the 90s, it would make it their best-selling arcade game. Now this is actually playable, it's primitive, but it is a game, I guess it had to be. Actually a stripped-back version of one of Sega's very early arcade hits called Head On, developed by American Sega subsidiary Gremlin Industries. Originally released in 1979, it was quite successful and inspired the whole dot-eating maze game genre, which Pac-Man made famous. And yes, Dottori Kun is even simpler than its inspiration, ultra minimalist and totally silent, but that was the point, it was made to be as cheap as possible with the minimum components. The arcade board's hardware itself is reminiscent of early computers or homebrew projects, a Z80 processor, a 2KB RAM chip, a 16KB ROM and a load of off-the-shelf logic chips which generate the video signal. Despite being so extremely basic, Dottori Kun does seem to have a bit of a cult following amongst Japanese arcade enthusiasts. There was even a Dottori Kun Contest streamed a few years ago. It also made it onto the Sega Astro City Mini desktop arcade cabinet thing released not long ago. An official acknowledgement of the game, but one without much explanation of its origins in English. But it was not the only game of its type, no surprise really, as Sega weren't the only cabinet maker. Taito's Minivader was released the same year, presumably included in their own cabinets. Clearly Space Invader inspired, it's probably actually a bit more fun than Dottori Kun, but just as uncomplicated. There's no score, no lives, you only get one chance, no sound once again, though it does have 8 different levels to play through with different formations of alien invaders. There's even less info about this online, at least in English, and Taito, as far as I can tell, have never acknowledged it officially. 8-Bit Manshed did a video about it a few years ago, which is well worth looking at, and I will link to that below. Konami also made arcade cabinets, and they too also created what is sometimes called a test board, or maybe loophole board would be a better name. This is Mogura Dese from 1991, a whack-a-mole style game, and it seems pretty darn high-end compared to what we've already seen. It's got colour, sound, some animation. You could almost mistake this for an actual normal game, though probably not from 1991, and it has more sophisticated hardware too. This seems to have a slightly different story though, maybe explaining its deluxe features. Apparently Konami offered a buyback scheme on these boards rather than expecting arcade technicians to just bin them or scavenge them for parts. They'd buy these boards back from game centres for 15,000 yen, about $100 and just stick them back into their cabinets to sell them to the next customer. Pretty clever, and that must have been enough to satisfy the legal requirements. A few years later, in 1996, they came out with a new, much simpler board. In fact, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this isn't a game at all. For some reason, this debug message is displayed for 7 minutes when it's switched on, and well, when the game does appear, it's hardly much of a game. The appearance of this board seems to coincide with the launch of Konami's Windy series of candy cabinets, and yeah, you can tell that was never intended for export markets. Total speculation on my part, but I do wonder if they switched tactics here from a buyback scheme to a just chuck it in the bin scheme like what Sega and Taito did. This board does look to be very similar to those others, a Z80 processor and some off-the-shelf logic chips, presumably much cheaper to make. The final game in this micro-genre with any recorded history that I can find is Battalion from Namco, released in 1993. Unlike the others, this is not emulated in MAME, and I can't really show it in action, but Stefan Lindburg has a gameplay video on the real hardware, which again I will link to. The most sophisticated of these games by far, once again inspired by an old classic, in this case Tank Battalion from 1980, but with more features this time, not less. In fact, it looks a bit like it might actually be an enjoyable game in its own right. The board for this is much more sophisticated too, with what might be a custom-made chip instead of just off-the-shelf parts. Was this made to be thrown out, or did they offer a buyback scheme? Well, I don't know. This and many other questions do remain unanswered. There were other big names in the cabinet business back then as well, like Capcom. What did they do? Is there a Capcom test board? There's no evidence of one that I've seen, but apparently Konami used to supply one of their old games, Mr. Goemon, with cabinets before they came up with the mole thing. Did Capcom do something similar? Or did they have some other sensible solution besides making bizarrely crap games heading straight for landfill? And what about SNK, Jaleco, Tecmo? They were all in the business. What game was supplied with IREM's Madonna cabinet? And in the All Japan Stupid Names for Arcade Cabinets Championship, who was crowned the final victor? I'm afraid there's a lot about this that I just can't answer. From what I can find, this law was repealed in 2001 though, and this surreal chapter in gaming history seems to have been happily forgotten by everyone involved. Why this ban was enacted in the first place and why it was repealed, I really don't know. It might just have been an accidental side effect of the wording of the law. Most of the sources about this in English seem to refer back to each other. I can only find one Japanese explanation of it, machine translated, and that is fairly scant on details. There could be way more to this story. Everyone could have got completely the wrong end of the stick. I mean, why not at least make them actually useful at testing the cabinets? I can't find the answers, but if you have any clue, comments are of course very welcome. I do know that these boards have now ended up in the hands of collectors, that's how they get emulated in MAME, and their workings are pretty well understood. And Chris Cavell, whose inventive retro projects I seem to keep mentioning in my videos, well, he's created a homebrew hack upgrade for Sega's Dottori Kun board called Dottori Kun Jr. It's even got colour on the title screen. This has lives and is quite a bit more like an actual game than the original, a sort of middle ground between Pac-Man and Head On. I have a feeling Sega might have rejected this though. Dottori Kun was probably created to be crap on purpose. If it was any good, it might have tempted Game Center managers to put it out for punters to play instead of more modern and expensive boards, and that might not have been good PR for Sega, but I'm speculating once again. So, crawling to the end, that is the tale of best-selling games that were not made to be played, but disposed of. Thank you once again to my wonderful Patreons. If anyone else would like to join them, as I always say, well, I really would be very appreciative. It does make a huge difference, it really does. If you're wondering where I got all the pictures of arcade stuff from, well, it's Arcade Club in Bury, though I would strongly advise you not to go there because I'm selfish and it's busy enough as it is. And I'll sign off and say thanks for watching, thanks for getting to the end, and goodbye. And just before I do go, I should mention the Beep Game Center blog, where I got a lot of really good info from for this video. There is a link below. And also, Arcade Club really is good. It's huge and has a room full of candy cabinets all loaded with great games.